So our first featured storyteller is Miriam Barnett. And Miriam, you are Chief Executive of Opportunity for the YWCA Pierce County. You've received numerous social justice awards. You serve on many boards for local, county, and state groups. You also teach at the University of Washington-Tacoma for their fundraising management program. And yet, from your biography, I am to believe that you somehow still have spare time during which you garden, make jewelry, knit, weave, create collages, and cook. And I think it's only because you're so young that you have that much energy. So, Miriam, your story that you're going to share with us today is going to take us back 12 years to when you first started working at the YWCA. What was it like?
So thank you, Megan. I started working at the YWCA on July 5th, 2005. And I was immediately impressed with all the comprehensive services that they offered for domestic violence victims and their families. But at the same time, I was equally appalled by the condition of the domestic violence shelter. The shelter had been designed in 1927 as a place for single traveling women to be safe at night. The YW would actually send a matron down to the train station to look for single traveling women moving west for work and offer them a free night stay at the YWCA. The 97 square foot rooms worked perfectly for that usage, with a shared kitchen and a shared bathroom on each of the 2 floors. But in 1976, we converted that space to the first domestic violence shelter in the state of Washington. The executive director at the time had death threats, and the police would show up at our door with an abuser and demand that we give his wife back. I certainly am grateful our relationship with the police has changed 100% since then. So those 97 square foot rooms that worked great for a single woman now were meant for a family, a mom and maybe 2 or 3 kids. And those single beds were replaced with a bunk bed. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm claustrophobic, and a bunk bed just isn't going to work for me, much less sharing a twin mattress with one of my children. And if I didn't want to spend the night there, why would I expect women and families in crisis to want to spend up to 90 days there? That's just not how I was raised. So one day the building started telling me it agreed with me because the pipes started breaking. It was too old of a building to accommodate families like that 24/7. So one day at about 2 in the morning, a pipe broke in the top floor bathroom of the shelter. And because no one was in the bathroom at the time, no one realized the pipe had broken. And by the time it was noticed, the water had gone down all 5 floors of the YWCA. And the floor immediately under the shelter, which was our big meeting room, was under about 2 feet of water. I got a phone call, and I went down, and I met our shelter manager. And she said to me when she saw the devastation, she said, "Miriam, would you just get this shelter out of this building?" And I said, "Yes, I will." And then I totally panicked because I had no idea how I was going to do it. I had never run a capital campaign before. But as luck would have it, as we approached about spring of 2007 and we were entering a recession, the apartment building across the street became available. So I looked at it, and it was perfect. It had 4 size units from small efficiencies to big 2 bedrooms. It would accommodate our families so well. So I went to the board, and I told them about it, and I asked if we could apply for a $1 million grant from the state so we could buy the building and start a $5 million capital campaign. And they agreed. So we applied. And then we waited, and we waited, and then we got word that we didn't get the grant. My board lost their courage, and I would go home every night, so discouraged, and I would vent to my husband. And after a while, even he said, "Do you really need to do this project?" The general consensus was the shelter was good enough. And if we could just wait for the recession to pass, perhaps we could just regroup then and decide what to do. But I couldn't wait. Both my parents really cared about the rights of others, so it was in my DNA. My dad was active in the civil rights movement, fighting for equal rights for African Americans back in the 60s. If he was alive today, he would proudly wear a Black Lives Matter t-shirt. I always thought he would be murdered because back then in the 60s, that's what happened to people who cared about the civil rights and worked for equality. People like Medgar Evers and Martin Luther King, and locally in Seattle, James Pratt, who was a friend of my father's. The Pratt Fine Arts Center is named after him. My parents would discuss these murders in our family home, and they left quite an impression on me. My dad did die when I was 18, but luckily he wasn't murdered. He died of a one and only heart attack. My mom was all about the Cesar Chavez United Farm Workers Union. Boycotting was her hobby. The list of things we couldn't eat, like grapes and head lettuce, and the places we couldn't shop, like Safeway, was long and lasted my entire childhood. When she was 70, she threw a party for herself, but she made it clear that no one was allowed to bring wine made from California grapes. And this was decades after the boycott had ended. It never ended for her. When I was growing up, we never went to the zoo or went out to eat or went on vacations. My mom had had 2 brain tumors, one before I was born and one after I was born, and so money was tight because the medical bills were high. So both my parents worked. My mom was an inner-city high school teacher in Seattle, and my dad was the executive director of a nonprofit social service agency with an office in Seattle and one in Portland. We would sometimes go with him to Portland, and we'd always stop in Tacoma at the Brown and Haley Seconds Factory. Mr. Haley was on my dad's board, and we would get to choose a misshapen mountain bar, which was a big deal because we were never allowed to have candy. So Tacoma has had a special place in my heart for many years. My dad loved his job, and my mom hated hers. So it was no surprise I became a CEO of a nonprofit organization. Because both of my parents worked and often had these causes they care about, they were rarely home. So I was a latchkey kid from the time I was in first grade until my entire childhood. I don't remember what my brother, who was 18 months older than me, did after school, but I would often forget my key, and so I would just wait in the garage for someone to come home. Back in that day, we didn't have to lock our garages, and I was too embarrassed to go to a neighbor's house and tell him I'd forgotten my key yet again. My mom didn't cook, so we were raised on TV dinners. My favorite was the Swanson macaroni and cheese that came in the round tin, and my brother, he loved those Hungry Man dinners, with the dessert on top. I became a vegetarian when I was 15. It was my way of taking my power back on my food choices. My mom would write me a blank check that she would sign, and I would walk to the grocery store and I'd buy the ingredients I needed to cook and to bake, 2 things I still love to do today. So a story I like to tell about my mom is that when my brother and I were in our early 20s, she invited us and our significant others over for Thanksgiving dinner. Now, you remember the part that she didn't cook, right? Okay, that's good. So I brought a vegetarian lasagna because at the time, my partner, who shortly thereafter became my husband, and I were vegetarian. And we got to my childhood home, and the table was set for us to sit down and have Thanksgiving dinner. Now, what you need to know is this was a miracle, because when I was growing up, we never had family dinners around that table. My mom was a hoarder, and the table was used for piling whatever she was hoarding. There was never a place at the table for a plate, and we never did sit together as a family. But for this day, the table was set, and we sat down, and the first thing she brought out was this big bowl of canned, overcooked peas, complete with the liquid from the can. It was like a treasure hunt finding those peas. And then she brought out the turkey so proudly on a platter, and it was completely pink. My brother gasped and said, "How long did you cook that bird?" And my mom said, "Well, for 30 minutes, just like the directions said." She missed the part that it was 30 minutes a pound. Needless to say, we all ate lasagna for dinner that night and swore we'd never go to her house again for a meal. My mom was just a great social justice advocate. She walked so many picket lines, and she did it with great gusto. I'm just not sure she was meant to be a mom. Her favorite story about me was that on my first day of kindergarten, she got a phone call from the school, and they told her she needed to come and bring a pair of underwear because while I had on a dress, I'd evidently forgotten to put on my underwear. She told this story a lot over and over again as if it was my fault, which, I believed it was. Until I was in my 50s, and she was telling me the story yet again, and I had this epiphany moment of, I think probably most moms help dress their kids on their first day of kindergarten, and I was able to give up the guilt. Yeah. So my story about my mom's inability to cook and her story about me not wearing my underwear, I think really makes my work more meaningful at the YWCA. You see, at the YWCA, and it's why I absolutely had to have a new shelter, and I couldn't give up that vision, because I wanted our families to have a dining room table. I wanted them, because I see that as a symbol of communication and unification and celebration. And that's what I had with my children. And just like me, most of our clients had never had that. And so I really was determined to make that possible. And as luck would have it, we found another pot of money that became available at the state level. And we applied, and then we waited, and we waited, and we found out that we were being granted $1.3 million. We bought the building, and then we continued to raise $5 million. Do you remember the part about how we were in a deep recession? And as we were about finished with the renovations, we started working with a furniture company because, we needed to outfit all those apartments. And we made it clear that our budget was $60,000 and that we needed things like, we wanted tables that had curved corners because we didn't want our kids hitting their head on any sharp, square tables. Well, they came back a little while later with the bid, and it was much higher than $60,000. Another dark day. Well, a board member, hearing of my woes, called me up and said, "Would you be willing to meet with my interior designer?" And I thought two things in that moment, quietly and to myself. The first was, if we can't afford furniture from a store, how are we going to afford interior designers? And the second thought was, she's a board member and I can't say no. So I met with the designer, and she had always had a dream of her own, a vision of her own. She had read a magazine years ago about a group of designers who'd adopted a shelter in California and completely outfitted it and made it a beautiful space. And she had always wanted to do that. And here was the opportunity. So she got 31 other designers to agree pro bono to adopt our apartments. They furnished them, they provided rugs and art and towels and bedding, you name it, and made those apartments the most beautiful apartments you will ever see. In fact, when we had our public opening, person after person came up to me and said, "This is so much nicer than where I live. I wish I could rent an apartment here." And in that moment, I knew my vision had been met. So I believe that if you really want something and you focus on it and you believe in it and set that intention, it can happen. One of my bracelets says, "She believed she could, so she did." And I wear it every day. So I feel so blessed that the YWCA has allowed me to live my passion and my values, but it's really done more for me than that. It allowed me to fill this void that I had since childhood of wanting to see families unite around a dining room table. So my life has taught me 3 important lessons, and here they are. Number 1, remember to wear your underwear. Number 2, family meals and food creates memories, both good and bad. And number 3, sometimes good enough isn't. If you're given the opportunity to help people in need, give the very best you can for as long as you can in any way that you can. Thank you very much.